A young SAS recruit spotted something that shouldn't exist. A tattoo on a royal guard's neck, a mark that belonged to a ghost story. A man who'd supposedly vanished from the world 3 years ago after a black operation went sideways in Syria. But there he was, standing perfectly still in crimson and gold, guarding Buckingham Palace like any other ceremonial soldier. Except he wasn't any other soldier. And what happened when the recruit whispered a single word, a call sign that officially never existed, changed everything both men thought they knew about duty, silence, and the weight of secrets that some people carry? Want to know exactly how it unfolded? First, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. These stories matter more than you might think. Now, let's get into it. The kind of London morning that made your bones ache. February wind cut through Horse Guards Parade, and the smell of wet wool and horse leather hung in the air. Tradition refusing to bow to weather. A formation of SAS recruits moved across the gravel, their tan berets dark with moisture. They were headed to Wellington Barracks for a leadership seminar, a break from selection training, though their posture said otherwise. Most cracked jokes under their breath, the usual banter of young men trying to prove they weren't impressed by anything. But Jamie Weller wasn't talking. 19 years old, quiet by nature, Jamie had earned a reputation for having the best eyes in his class. The instructors kept saying, "Weller sees things." Sometimes it was a compliment. Sometimes it sounded like a warning. Right now, those eyes were locked on something that made his chest tight. Standing motionless beside the old archway was a royal guard. Tall, broad-shouldered, crimson tunic, pressed to geometric perfection. The black bearskin cap shadowed his face. White gloves gripping his ceremonial rifle with textbook precision. To any tourist, he looked exactly like every other guard on postcards. Perfect British pageantry. But Jamie's gaze had fixed on something tourists wouldn't notice. Just above the white collar, barely visible where fabric met skin, was a dark curve of ink. Small, sharp, deliberate. Jamie's stomach dropped. That shape. He'd seen it before, sketched in training manuals, drawn on barrack walls by instructors who never explained what it meant. Always the same design. A half-sun with 3 descending blades, like rays cutting downward through shadow. But that was impossible, because the only man who'd supposedly carried that mark had vanished from the world 3 years ago. Walked into Syrian wilderness during a black operation that officially never happened and never walked back out. One of Jamie's mates elbowed him. "Oi, Weller, you look like you've seen a bloody ghost." Jamie swallowed hard, eyes still fixed on the guard. The man hadn't moved, not even a blink, but something in the set of his jaw suggested he was fighting something, or remembering something. "Maybe I have," Jamie whispered. Their instructor's voice cut through the air. "Keep it moving, lads!" Jamie turned to follow, but not before stealing one more glance. Still motionless, still perfect, still carrying that impossible mark like a secret burning beneath his skin. And Jamie could have sworn the man's fingers had tightened almost imperceptibly around his rifle. The response you'd expect from someone who'd just heard a name he thought he'd buried forever. 3 years ago, during selection training, the instructors had told them a story. Never during official briefings, always late at night, when exhaustion wore down barriers between legend and fact. There had been an operator, special boat service originally, but he'd gone black. Deep black. Operations that didn't get logged anywhere, in places where the map ended and the real work began. His call sign was Ashdown. The instructors never confirmed if it was real, but the story persisted, passed down like dark folklore. Ashdown had been operating near the Turkish border when everything went sideways. A hostage recovery that turned into something bigger. Air support that never came. Extraction that never arrived. Communications that went silent when they mattered most. The cleanup crew found shell casings, blood trails, signs of a firefight that lasted hours, but no body, no equipment, no trace of the man who'd called for help that never came. "He walked out of the world," one instructor had muttered while cleaning his rifle. And nobody knows if he chose to disappear or if the world just forgot where to look. Ghost stories in military barracks always have one detail that makes them stick. In Ashdown's case, it was a tattoo, a half-sun arched over 3 descending blades. The instructors said it marked an unsanctioned operation that saved lives but could never be acknowledged. Jamie had sketched it once, then crossed it out. He didn't like believing in heroes who couldn't be proven to exist. Until this morning, when he'd seen it burned into the neck of a man standing perfectly still for tourists and cameras. A fellow recruit leaned over and whispered, "You're miles away, mate. What's got you so twisted up?" Jamie looked at him for a moment, weighing how much truth he could share without sounding completely mad. "Henderson," he said quietly, "you ever hear stories about operators who just disappear, not killed in action, not transferred, just gone?" Henderson frowned. "Like deserters?" "No, like ghosts. People who walked away from everything and never came back." "You've been reading too many thriller novels, Weller. Real world doesn't work like that." But Jamie wasn't so sure anymore, because the real world had just put a dead man in a red tunic and positioned him to guard the most famous palace in England, and the only people who seemed to notice were the ones who knew which shadows to look for. The next morning, Jamie made his way back to Horse Guards Parade. The cold had settled deeper into the stones, frost making everything look sharp-edged and brittle. He'd volunteered for a fictional supply run, buying himself 90 minutes before anyone noticed he wasn't where he was supposed to be. He needed to know, not for glory or satisfaction, but because some questions don't let go until you find answers. The guard was there, exactly where Jamie had seen him yesterday. Same impossible stillness, same precision, same bearskin cap shadowing his face completely. Jamie moved closer to the rope barrier, trying to look like another curious tourist, but his heart hammered as his eyes went straight to that space where the white collar met the man's neck. It was that dark curve of ink, the half-sun with 3 blades. Jamie stood close enough to see individual threads in the crimson wool, close enough to whisper a single word that would either confirm everything or mark him as insane. He leaned forward, barely breathing the syllables. "Ashdown!" The guard didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink, but something shifted in the air between them. Recognition wrapped in warning. A ceremonial marshal appeared beside Jamie. "Sir, you'll need to maintain proper distance from the guard." "Of course," Jamie said, stepping back, just admiring the tradition. The marshal studied him, noting the military bearing Jamie couldn't hide, then nodded. Tradition's worth respecting, from the proper distance. As Jamie turned to leave, he caught something in his peripheral vision. The guard's hand had shifted almost imperceptibly on his rifle, not random, deliberate, the kind of subtle signal operators use when they need to acknowledge something without breaking cover. Jamie walked away with his mind racing. He didn't have proof, couldn't explain why he was certain. But some men earn the right to be forgotten, and others earn the duty to remember them quietly. The cafe near Victoria Barracks had the worn atmosphere of a place built for utility. Jamie sat with untouched coffee, studying Staff Sergeant Colin Drescher across the room, former artillery, now logistics. The kind of career soldier who'd seen enough to know when to talk and when to stay quiet. Jamie approached with his tray. "Mind if I share the table, Staff?" Drescher looked up, studying Jamie with automatic assessment. "You're one of the selection lads. Sit if you want." Jamie settled across from him, working out his approach. "Staff," he said eventually, "you ever see guards come back to ceremonial duty after extended absence?" Drescher's eyes never left his newspaper, but Jamie caught the slight pause. Define extended. Years. Long enough that people might have assumed they weren't coming back at all. Drescher set the paper down, giving Jamie his full attention. What exactly are you fishing for, son? Jamie aimed for casual. Saw a guard yesterday who didn't look like your average ceremonial soldier. He had a tattoo, not regimental, something that looked like it belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to still be wearing red. Something in the air shifted. You've got good eyes, Drescher said after a moment. But sometimes good eyes see things that are meant to stay unseen. Jamie leaned forward. But you know what I'm talking about. Drescher studied him, then leaned back. Son, there's a difference between soldiers who serve and soldiers who disappear. Some men fall off the official roster for good reasons. Others come back because the silence is the only place left where the world makes sense to them. Jamie said nothing. If you think you've spotted someone who's supposed to be gone, best thing you can do is respect the disappearance. Don't chase ghosts. When Drescher stood to leave, he paused. Some stories are meant to be whispered, not solved. And some men earn respect by never having their names spoken aloud. Behind the guardroom, Captain Hannah Rees wasn't someone who lingered without purpose. 23 years of service had taught her efficiency, but she'd stopped walking when she reached the equipment bay. Through the partially open door, she could see a figure removing his ceremonial uniform with methodical precision. And at the base of his neck was a mark she recognized from classified briefings that technically didn't exist. Half sun. 3 descending blades. The symbol that belonged to operations so far off the books that only a handful of people knew what it meant. Rees had read the after-action reports that were never filed. She knew about Syria, about extraction that never came, about a man who'd walked into hell and somehow walked back out only to disappear completely. She didn't speak. But when the man's reflection appeared in the equipment locker's glass door, their eyes met. She nodded once. Not the crisp acknowledgement between ranks, but something quieter. Recognition between people who understood things that couldn't be spoken aloud. He nodded back. No words exchanged. No old call signs mentioned. Just acknowledgement between soldiers who understood that some truths were too heavy for ordinary conversation. As Rees turned to leave, a younger officer rounded the corner from the main corridor, clipboard in hand and the kind of eager energy that marked him as someone still trying to prove himself. "Ma'am, aren't you headed to the evening debrief?" "I am," Rees replied smoothly, falling into step beside him. "Had to verify something. It's been handled." The lieutenant didn't ask for details, and Rees didn't offer any. Behind them, in the equipment bay, the man who officially didn't exist finished securing his gear and removed a small worn photograph from his jacket pocket. Edges soft with age, creases from being folded and unfolded countless times. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, then slipped it back into his boot, where it would stay until his next shift ended. His ceremonial duty was over for the day, but his watch never ended. Jamie Weller had learned to carry questions differently now. Instead of pressing against his thoughts like weights he needed to shift, they'd settled into something more like background music, always present, but no longer demanding constant attention. He'd stopped trying to solve the mystery and started trying to understand what it meant to be trusted with one. It was typical February misery. Cold rain that seemed to come from every direction at once. The kind of weather that made you question why humans had ever thought living in Britain was a good idea. Jamie's selection training group was running equipment checks in one of the supply buildings near Wellington Barracks, the kind of routine maintenance that kept soldiers busy while teaching them that warfare was 10% action and 90% making sure your gear didn't fail when it mattered. But Jamie's attention kept drifting to conversations happening at the edges of his hearing. 2 staff sergeants near the radio equipment were discussing ceremonial rotations. Nothing classified, Nothing sensitive, just the ordinary logistics of making sure the right people were in the right places at the right times. Adjustment to the horse guard's detail, one of them was saying. New assignment coming in from personnel. Permanent posting? Looks like it. Background verification already cleared. Command authorization from someone high enough that I'm not asking questions. Jamie's hands stilled on the rifle he was cleaning. Anyone we know? Doubt it, but whoever it is, they've got the kind of service record that makes you feel inadequate just reading the redacted version. The conversation drifted to other topics, but Jamie had heard enough. Somewhere in the bureaucracy of military personnel management, someone had made sure that a ghost could serve again without having to explain how he'd come back from the dead. That took influence. The kind that reached above the normal channels of command structure. That evening, Jamie found himself walking past Horse Guards Parade again. Not searching for answers this time, just paying his respects to something he was beginning to understand was larger than any individual story. The ceremonial duty had ended for the day, but the weight of tradition lingered in the empty courtyard. Tomorrow there would be tourists and cameras and children asking their parents why the guards couldn't smile. The ancient machinery of pageantry would continue its measured rotations, as it had for centuries. But now, Jamie understood that some of the men holding those posts carried more than ceremonial weapons. They carried memories that officially didn't exist, skills that were never supposed to be used again, and the kind of discipline that could only be forged in places where survival depended on staying absolutely still while the world exploded around you. A week later, during a field exercise in the Brecon Beacons, Jamie's instructor pulled him aside. "Weller, you've been different lately, steadier, more focused. Whatever's changed, keep it." Jamie nodded, but didn't explain that he'd learned something about service that wasn't covered in any training manual. He'd learned that duty wasn't just about following orders or maintaining equipment or even protecting people. Sometimes duty was about becoming invisible, so that something larger than yourself could continue to exist. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that nobody ever heard about. And sometimes the highest honor you could receive was having your name erased from every record so that you could serve again in silence. That night, as Jamie cleaned his gear in the barracks, he thought about the guard standing his watch in London. Motionless under lights that never dimmed, carrying secrets that would never be told, protecting something that mattered more than his own identity. And for the first time since joining the SAS selection program, Jamie understood what they meant when they talked about soldiers who never came home, not because they'd died, but because they'd found something worth staying for. The rain had stopped by Thursday morning, leaving Horse Guards Parade glistening under weak sunlight that made the wet stones look like polished metal. Jamie stood at the far edge of the tourist area, no longer trying to hide his interest or pretend he was just another sightseer. He'd moved beyond curiosity now into something that felt more like vigil. The guard was in position, exactly as he'd been every day for the past 2 weeks. Same impossible stillness, same flawless uniform, same bearing that suggested he could stand there until the stones beneath his feet crumbled to dust. But Jamie was reading different details now. The way the man's breathing never varied from its measured rhythm. How his grip on the ceremonial rifle adjusted minutely for wind or fatigue, but never relaxed. The fact that his eyes, shadowed beneath the bearskin cap, seemed to track movement at the periphery of his vision, even while maintaining their fixed forward focus. These weren't the habits of ceremonial duty. They were the reflexes of someone who'd spent years in places where a moment's inattention could be fatal. Jamie had positioned himself where the guard could see him clearly during his measured turns. Not close enough to draw official attention, but visible enough that his presence registered. He wasn't trying to make contact anymore. That wasn't the point. He was simply bearing witness to something that deserved to be seen, even if it could never be acknowledged. On the guard's third rotation, their eyes met for perhaps half a second. No expression passed between them, no signal or gesture. Just the simple recognition that some things were understood without being spoken. Jamie had learned patience during selection training, but this was different. This was the kind of waiting that came with accepting that some stories were more important than the people who lived them. That some men earned the right to be forgotten, precisely because forgetting them allowed them to serve in ways that remembering never could. A family with young children moved to the rope barrier nearby, the kids chattering excitedly about the toy soldier who never moved. Their mother shushed them gently, explaining that guards weren't toys but real soldiers with important jobs. One of the children, a girl of maybe 6, stared up at the guard with the kind of unblinking attention that only children possess. "Mummy," she said, "why does he look sad?" Her mother glanced at the guard's face, shadowed and impassive beneath his bearskin cap. "I don't think he looks sad, sweetheart. I think he looks serious." "But his eyes are sad," the girl insisted, "like when Daddy talks about Grandpa's war." Jamie felt something tighten in his chest. Children saw things that adults learned to overlook. They hadn't yet been trained to mistake stillness for emptiness or discipline for automation. The girl's mother guided her away with gentle words about not staring, but the child looked back over her shoulder until the guard disappeared from view. Jamie remained for another hour, watching the measured rotations, the perfect discipline, the weight of sense that seemed to press down on the ancient stones. When he finally left, it wasn't because he'd learned everything he needed to know. It was because he'd learned enough to understand that some lessons were meant to be carried rather than solved. Walking back toward his transport, Jamie passed a newspaper stand where the vendor was arranging the morning editions. Headlines about political scandals and economic uncertainty filled the front pages, but none of them mentioned the men who stood guard while the world argued about everything except what was actually worth protecting. That seemed appropriate somehow. The most important things often happened in silence, protected by people whose names would never appear in any headline. Jamie bought a copy of the Telegraph, not because he particularly wanted to read the news, but because ordinary actions felt important after witnessing something extraordinary. As he tucked the paper under his arm and walked toward the bus stop, he caught himself moving differently, spine straighter, steps more measured, eyes scanning his surroundings with the kind of automatic awareness that was becoming second nature. He was learning, without quite realizing it, to carry himself like someone who understood that duty wasn't a burden to be endured, but a privilege to be honored. The ride back to base was quiet, but Jamie's mind wasn't empty. He was thinking about the difference between serving and surviving, between being forgotten and choosing to disappear, about the weight that some men carried and the silence they earned by carrying it without complaint. By the time he reached Hereford, Jamie had made a decision that felt more like recognition than choice. He would never speak the name Ashdown aloud again. Not because he doubted what he'd seen, but because silence was the only gift he could offer to someone who'd already given everything else to causes that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. At night, Jamie opened his training notebook and found the page where he'd once sketched a half-sun with 3 descending blades. Instead of crossing it out again, he carefully tore out the page and fed it to the small fire burning in the barracks heating stove. As the paper curled and blackened, Jamie made himself a promise. He would carry the lesson without carrying the burden. He would remember the importance of forgotten men without forgetting why they'd chosen to be forgotten. Some stories were meant to be witnessed, not repeated. Some heroes were meant to be honored, not named. And some forms of service were so deep that they could only be protected by silence. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of February day that made London look sharp-edged and purposeful. Jamie had a day pass, officially for personal errands, though everyone understood it was really a mental health break from the intensity of selection training. Instead of sleeping late or finding a pub, he'd made his way back to Horse Guards Parade one final time. Not to confirm anything or solve any remaining mysteries. Simply to pay his respects in the only way that seemed appropriate. The ceremonial changeover was scheduled for 11, and Jamie positioned himself among the small crowd of tourists and locals who'd gathered to watch. The ancient ritual unfolded with mathematical precision, measured steps called commands, the seamless transfer of responsibility from one guard to another. And there, taking his position at the post, was the man Jamie now thought of simply as the guard. No names, no call signs, no speculation about what he'd done or where he'd been. Just recognition of someone who'd chosen to serve again in the only way the world would allow him to disappear. As the guard settled into his position, spine straight, rifle held with perfect form, eyes fixed on that invisible point that ceremonial soldiers learned to see, Jamie felt something settle in his own chest. Not closure exactly, but completion. The understanding that some circles close themselves when you stop trying to force them. Nearby, raised a camera, but Jamie found himself hoping the photos wouldn't capture what he'd seen. Some things were meant to exist in memory rather than documentation. After 20 minutes of watching the guard's measured rotations, Jamie turned to leave. But as he walked away, he heard footsteps behind him. Measured, purposeful, but not urgent. He turned to see Captain Hannah Reese approaching, her dress uniform immaculate, her bearing suggesting she had something specific to say. "Recruit Weller," she said when she reached him. Not a question about how she knew his name. Clearly she'd made it her business to know. "Ma'am, you've been a regular visitor to this particular post." Jamie met her gaze steadily. "Yes, ma'am." "And you've shown appropriate discretion in your observations." "I try to respect what I see, ma'am." Captain Reese studied him for a moment, and Jamie had the sense he was being evaluated for something he didn't fully understand. "Good," she said finally. "That kind of respect is rare, especially in young soldiers who think every mystery needs to be solved and every story needs to be told." She paused and Jamie waited. "The men who stand these posts," she continued, "they're not museum pieces. They're not tourist attractions. They're soldiers doing their duty in the way they've chosen to do it. And sometimes the greatest service we can provide is to let them do that duty without requiring them to explain themselves." "I understand, ma'am." "I believe you do." Captain Reese's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The guard you've been watching, he's earned the right to serve in silence, and you've shown that you understand what that means." Jamie nodded. "Your selection training ends in 6 weeks," she said. "When it does, regardless of whether you pass or fail, you'll have learned something that most soldiers never understand, that the highest form of respect is sometimes knowing when not to ask questions." She turned to go, then paused. "That lesson will serve you well, Recruit Weller, whatever path you choose from here." After she'd gone, Jamie stood for a moment longer, watching the guard continue his silent vigil. Then he walked away, knowing he wouldn't return. Not because he'd lost interest, but because he'd gained something more valuable, the understanding that some forms of service were too sacred to interrupt with curiosity. The bus ride back to base was quiet, but Jamie's mind was clear, in a way it hadn't been for weeks. He'd set out to solve a mystery and instead had learned something about duty that no training manual could teach. Back at Hereford, his fellow recruits were preparing for an evening navigation exercise. Jamie joined them with the kind of focused attention that his instructors had been hoping to see throughout the entire selection process. He cleaned his gear more carefully, listened to briefings more intently, and carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd internalized lessons about service that went deeper than regulation or procedure. That night, as the barracks settled into quiet, Jamie lay on his narrow bunk, thinking about the weight that some men chose to carry. About the difference between serving for recognition and serving for duty itself. About the fact that the most important work often happened in silence, protected by people whose names would never be known. He fell asleep thinking about a guard standing watch in London, protecting something larger than himself, carrying memories that officially didn't exist, and finding meaning in duty that required him to be forgotten. And for the first time since beginning SAS selection, Jamie understood that passing or failing the program mattered less than what kind of man he became in the process. Some victories were measured in silence rather than achievement. Some forms of success required you to disappear completely into something larger than yourself. As he drifted off to sleep, Jamie made himself one final promise. Whatever path his military career took from here, he would remember that the highest honour wasn't being recognised for your service. It was being trusted to serve in ways that could never be acknowledged. Some men earned medals. Others earned the right to be forgotten. And the truly exceptional ones earned both, then chose silence. Have you ever encountered someone whose past seemed too heavy for ordinary conversation? Someone whose presence suggested stories that were never meant to be told? The question isn't whether legends like that deserve to be revealed, it's whether they deserve to be protected. Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if this story moved you, even quietly, hit that like button and subscribe for daily stories about the remarkable men and women who serve in ways that history never records. Share this with someone who understands that real strength doesn't need explanation, and that the most important victories are often the ones nobody ever hears about. Your next story is waiting right now on your screen. Click it, and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that heroes don't always wear their names on their uniforms. Sometimes they earn the right to serve without them.